Hey, fellow GNTers, those of us who like our spirituality with a twist. So we're into another one of our little series that we like to do, and we're working through this subject that we've actually kind of held off a long time talking about. We did a lot of spiritual stuff, but we haven't really talked much about Tantra in the sense of Karmamudra, what it really means to work with a partner, sexuality and spirituality in kind of a different way than we've done. We did a lot of relationship and love kind of stuff, especially 2023. So if you want to go back and peek those. And last week we started our like really talking about more the Tantra Karma Mudra part of things. And if you're following along, last week we kind of did kind of the what is it and the whys of why you would do it. I wasn't sure if you had anything else you wanted to say about that, Daniel, before we click this along. You're good. Okay.
Oh yeah.
I wasn't sure if the end you had anything else that you wanted to add to that. But we did a lot on kind of the reasons why you would want to work with the sexual energies, either as part of your own meditative practice or with a partner, right? And so we did a lot of that kind of stuff. And this week, we're going to work through Dr. Nita's, and I'm going to hold this little book up here for the camera, right? Ideas of 6 misconceptions about sexuality and meditative practice and Tantra and Karma Mudra specifically. So we're doing a kind of a traditional Asian cultural thing. We're kind of using a text, in this case, Dr. Nita, and we're kind of taking his stuff as sort of a starting place, and we're going to do some commentary. But whatever Daniel and I want to share as our ideas about this, right, to complement what he's doing. All right, cool. So I think my thought on the six misconception things would be something like, it'll give us a chance to look at what he's saying, and then, I guess I already said it. Anything that we want to add, around that, I think that's kind of an interesting thing to do. So, okay, cool. Six misconceptions. So the first one is this whole question of secrecy.
Yeah.
So should these things be out in the public domain, or should they be kept more on the QT and be more secret? I was kind of thinking about this whole set of episodes earlier, and I was thinking how interesting it, like, again, we try to be personal on the podcast, and I was like, it is interesting for me because I never really thought I'd talk about this stuff in a public way. I always thought it would be more of like things that were private, but I do think there's something good about going out and having these conversations. At least I can feel it for myself. Talking about these things in a more open way, it feels good. Yet at the same time, I kind of thought, wow, I never thought I would do this, and yet here we are. So I don't know how that feels for you, Daniel.
I mean, there are not really, I know many traditions hold things secret, but I don't know. I think at this day and age, like there's so much information out there. It's hard to find things of real depth in general, just because you're sort of like drugged down so many different pathways with people who know tiny bits of things that then sell you on something else. And so, we talked about this, maybe a month, 2 months ago, one of the obstacles being like false teachers, just kind of
Yeah.
charlatan type people. And so that's part of the problem. But the other part is that like there's many things that are kept secret. And I just feel like if you are, for whatever reason, attracted to particular teachings, you're going to find them. And whether or not someone wants to keep them secret or not, I don't know. I'd rather have things be out there. And even if they get bastardized and whatever, people who are interested and who are going to practice, and not looking for just like a quick fix or a talking point, they will make their way to it. And having this information available, I think, gives a little bit of a wider net for folks who might not have normally found it. So I'm a little bit less on the taboo stuff. I do realize that it was used previously as a filter, right? To
Yeah.
find more dedicated students and to hold these things in high regard. It's like, we don't ever talk about this, but like I taught Reiki for many years.
Mm.
And, one of the things that you learn in the course is that like when it came to the States in like maybe the 60s, I think I
Mm.
remember when it was, they would charge back then like $10,000 to learn it.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right. Like this, in today's
And
money, I
that's
don't
in the
know.
1960s. That's like, yeah.
Yeah, that's probably 100 grand now,
Hmm.
so it's like, imagine you're going to learn something that you don't even know who's going to use it, but you're going to get charged $100,000 to learn. But what it does is it creates a very, very high value, because it's taking your value system and maxing it out and saying, this is so unique. so special, it's going to cost this much. Now, obviously, there's a high amount of scarcity to that, so that this elastic kind of economic relationship between that and its availability makes it such that you could charge that. But what I'm just using the point that it's very expensive, but it was also very rare.
Mm.
However, it is not that case anymore. It is not even 10,000 now, not even close to that. And anybody could learn it. The, stuff is all out there. They still want to try and keep some things kind of secret, but most of it you can find on, Google articles or whatever internet articles, you know what I'm saying? So I just feel like say what you're going to say, teach what you're going to teach, and those who are interested are going to practice it. And in today's age where the attention is so diffused, um, as much as you can kind of throw a little flair along someone's potential algorithmic journey throughout the internet, because you are not free to choose what it is that you want to see on the internet as much anymore. It's like what's handed to you based on previous search history, location, demographics. Like you're being sold stuff as soon as you go online. It's like you're
The political perspectives of Elon Musk, for example.
there you go. Yeah. I mean, and
Yeah,
what
yeah,
they
yeah,
say about, everybody and their assholes is that they all stink, you know?
yeah,
Oh, I'm sorry, their opinions.
yeah.
Um, so I'm just, for me, I know a little bit longer tirade, but like I'm very pro open it up.
Yeah, yeah,
Open the
yeah.
floodgates. The information is here, the philosophy is here, the tradition holders are here, there's text being written, there's stuff being talked about. Like if people are interested, as they say in Arabic, yalla.
Mm. It's kind of like this was partially like a little astrological in the sense that we're going into the age of Aquarius,
Sure.
the age of Pisces, and Pisces was going to be things were spiritual but secret, right? And now you're in the time where everything's going to blow up and become more public,
Yeah.
right? And I was struck by this over the course of my little spiritual life, right? That all of a sudden things that you'd have to climb to a top of a mountain to get, you know, or you'll wander in the desert for many years, you can just like get that thing like online and have it delivered to your house, right?
Yeah.
I can remember when like I was listening to the guy who was translating the Zohar, which is one of the big Kabbalistic books. Not even just a book, but like a whole set of volumes, real elaborate Kabbalistic, very deep stuff. And I remember like just go and was translating it and I was listening to him giving a lecture about it. And I was like, this is wild. This is a wild time to be alive because you can read like the most mysterious Tantra and
Hmm.
the Zohar and the
Yes.
Sufi teachings and all this. I mean, that's part of what our podcast is about too,
Yeah,
right? We're in
totally.
this time where all this stuff is now available. And in one lifetime, you can read all that shit. Who could do that before? Have that much exposure to so many things, right?
Mm.
If you get to whether it should be secret or not, I mean, the Dalai Lama agrees with you, and I think he's been a real positive influence in this, right? Because he basically has said, okay, if we don't put these things out, we're just going to get a bunch of shoddy stuff that goes out. So we better put out things that are authentic
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it'll just flood with a bunch of stuff that's kind of like meh, to like not good at all. Maybe not just meh, but like, and that will be bad. And he shares this anecdote where he said he was in India, and there was kind of a guy who was a supporter, an Indian guy. He was like a businessman or something, nice guy, generating good karma by supporting things. And he was at the Dalai Lama's place, wherever this was, and there was a manuscript there of something secret and tantric. And the guy just started flipping through it and reading it. And the Dalai Lama was going, okay, this probably wouldn't have happened before, right? Where some person would just come up and read these things. And then the guy said, well, I can read those words. I have no idea what the hell any of that means.
Mm.
And the Dalai Lama was just like, okay, good. That's how it's going to be going forward. We're going to put these things out, that otherwise would have been kept very much on the QT. And, people who want to find their way to it will get it, right? And it's
Mhm.
better to have that happen in a situation where people who are searching for things that are real can find them.
Right.
And we'll do the best we can to be respectful of that while we're doing this
Yeah.
episode.
Yeah.
So maybe some balance. I think Gelik Rinpoche was really big on the idea that you should keep some things secret. So I think there are things that out of respect for him, I'm going to do, but other stuff we're going to talk about. Though I guess I thought I'd never talk about any of this. So I'm glad we have this podcast. It feels
Hmm.
good to share some of this stuff.
Hmm.
Okay. Misconception number one. Misconception number two. Is this a lost or dying tradition? Um, so I think what Dr. Nita is trying to get here is that it can be kind of difficult to do some of these practices if you try to do them in the most demanding ways, right? You know, you could turn these things into really difficult, either meditative exercises or like sexual acrobatics or something.
Hmm.
And it could be maybe in a way that like they could feel like, well, you know, that's kind of daunting. But I think what Dr. Nita is trying to do, which I think is our goal to emulate, would be like do this in a way that's sort of more accessible to people. So it doesn't have to be so absolutely difficult or something. We can kind of try to keep it real, but also make it like available or something. So that's his misconception number two. You got thoughts on that at all, Daniel?
Mm, not really.
Okay. Okay. You know, like I remember like the first time I met Lama Glenn, he was talking, we were talking, he said, like, I don't mind doing really complicated meditations. I don't. I kind of enjoy them, you know?
Yeah,
But
but
like I also can recognize that they're not for everybody, kind of, right? So
yeah, and you have to, you got to break things down and give it to people in a way that is, digestible. And so even now, like my own practice is still growing, even we haven't even talked about this, you and I, a little bit, but like, even in the last month, there's been like a lot of progress, and I'm not sure where it's came from, you know?
mhm.
So I think you really have to try, we have to, in interpreting these things, provide context, right? But then also understand the audience, and that like we're providing commentary on a text, which means there's a text that they can go to, and that there's text that those texts comes from, and there's traditions and stuff that follow
Mhm.
them. So we are a bridge. We're a gateway drug, if you will. Um,
Mhm.
and I want to ensure, that people understand, not that anybody really says anything a whole lot about this, but I want to consciously express that I am aware of my role in that part. I didn't create anything. We are sharing things that are useful for us and have been useful for many other practitioners for the last, at least, I don't know, since Padmasambhava. So I don't know when he was around,
Well,
1100.
you talk about like, yeah, probably you're going like a thousand years, but like even more so, right? Because these things probably go back deep,
Right.
deep,
So at
right?
least a
Yeah.
thousand years. So,
Mhm.
we're the entrance towards that. So
I kind of get, and you know, if we talk about it honestly between the two of us, I don't mind going to things that are deeper and more challenging when we're talking here. And you are usually kind of like pulling me back.
yeah,
And we have our own little dynamic in this, right? One
yeah,
or the other of us might go kind of deep, and the other person will go kind of like, well, then let's make it accessible.
correct.
And we go back and forth on this, right? And it's kind of like a little bit of like, okay, let's make it real, you know, let's make it deep. And then also at times, whether it's you or me, sometimes it's you saying, hey, dude, pull it back,
Mm,
which is fine, right? And you know, or it's the opposite, you know, whichever one of us is going into the place where we also try to balance it out by going, okay, let's also
yeah,
make sure that we have a range of things for people who want to go dive into deeper waters. We got some stuff there, but we also got
correct.
people who are, hey, I'm like learning how to swim. I'm getting into things where I want to see if this fits me. So I'm putting the toe in the water here and there, and that's all fine and all good. All right, so that's his misconception number two. That seems fine. That probably means more in the context of someone coming from a Tibetan place too, because there might be all kinds of ideas. You have to have all of this very advanced stuff with this, but you don't necessarily have to have this. Okay, misconception number three, and I think this is one you've been wanting to talk about for a while, Daniel. So I think I'll throw it out to you first,
Sure.
because to me, I think you brought it up a bit ago. This is the difference between what you might call Karmamudra and what you might call Kamasutra.
Sutra. Yeah.
So I don't know if you want to take the lead on that one or if you want me to like.
Yeah, you start it, and then
Okay.
I
All
mean,
right. So the idea is that these really aren't quite the same thing.
yeah.
Kama Sutra comes more, you know, is more a thing about like the joy of sex or something like that, right? Trying to go and get something that's more about sexual enjoyment, sexual learning about sexuality, learning technique within sexuality, these kinds of things to optimize one's joyfulness of one's sexual experience or something, right? This is the Kama Sutra thing.
Mm,
When I was thinking about this today, I recall that we had a copy of this in my house growing up.
Mm,
And I was never quite sure why. I wasn't sure if it was my mom's, and maybe I should ask her. And she would answer that. Or whether it was my grandpa's, because my grandpa was a little bit of like he was a little bit of a fuckboy.
mm,
So it might have been his, I don't know. But we had it, and I remember picking it as like a teenager or something, right?
mm,
So there were definitely like books like this in the house. There was like the Kama Sutra, and then like the old school classic was like The Joy of Sex, you know, and reading those things. It's more about again the enjoyment of sexuality, So that's one thing, but it's not quite the same as doing sexuality for the purpose of like spirituality. Those aren't quite the same thing, right?
yeah.
Now, it was interesting in reading Dr. Nida, he kind of talked about this thing of like, as far as Tibetan culture goes, there was like a kind of understanding that these aren't quite the same thing. And yet at the same time, they're not fighting each other, right? You can have the Kama Sutra enjoyment of sexuality and the sexual spirituality together. And one of the people he referenced here, it's really kind of an interesting Tibetan character. We might have to do some episode on him later on, just characters in the spiritual world. He's really kind of a fascinating guy named Gendon Chupal. Hope I'm doing that totally right. But he has a book that's sort of like a little bit Kama Sutra, a little bit Karmamudra, kind of like integrated together. I definitely read that one. I thought this is interesting. He's trying to like bridge the gap between these things. And Dr. Nida in his book that we're using kind of talks about this. And he's kind of a
Mhm.
wild, rebellious character. I have a soft spot for those kinds of people. So I definitely liked his whole backstory, which we can tell another time. And I kind of like reading his work. And he definitely went around and talked to like he was doing funny stuff in Tibet. He would go and talk to a bunch of Tibetan women, like, "What do you think about sex?" He'd be asking them things, and probably a little bit, maybe a little bit more challenging the modesty of people or something. But he
Mhm.
did all these things, and he's an interesting character. So he's a guy. I've read his book, and he's a curious cat. Or then he mentioned Lama Mifam, who's kind of this really like another person I have a soft spot for because he's this really brilliant uh, kind of commentator on the tantric tradition in the Nyingma. There's these big schools of Tibetan Buddhism, and one is the Nyingma, and he's like really great for talking about how you experience reality as bliss and things like that. Lama Mifam, and I was reading him a lot during my little retreat that I came out of a couple of weeks ago, right? So Lama
Mhm.
Mifa has been on my mind. So I was like, and he apparently wrote something like this too, where he was like, let's pull the Kama Sutra and the Karma Mudra together and make it like a thing. So I like that idea, So that's sort of what Dr. Nita presents on it and some of my feelings about it.
Mhm.
I think so maybe the problem, and maybe you have something to say about this, might be when people get these things confused.
Yeah.
When the Kama Sutra thing becomes everything and you lose the idea that there's a spiritual part to this or something, that might be the problem in America. Does that make sense to you or fit into
Okay.
somewhat you think about that?
Yeah. So I'll first share um how I learned what I know about the practice of Kama Sutra.
Hmm.
From what I learned, Kama Sutra was taught as the yogic, meaning yogi, those who practice yoga, not, and I don't mean like, I don't know, core power, no offense to core power, but like I'm not talking about like Lululemon yoga. I'm talking about yogis from
Yeah.
back in the day, right? People who are trying to work towards union, right? Mind, body,
Hmm.
all this kind of stuff. Fine. That this was a school, that this was a practice that was developed, that it was the yogic approach to sex, meaning the scientific approach to sex. And what is the goal of sex? Pleasure, bliss, right?
Hmm.
Union. So this is sex yoga. Okay.
Hmm.
And so what do yogis do? They try and break things down scientifically, really, to get to
Hmm.
the core pieces of things and then put them and then reassemble them back together in a system that's going to be more effective, right? Or higher effective, with a higher rate of effectiveness. All right, fine. So you now have this practice of lovemaking, right? This practice of sexuality, of sexual union on both the male and female side. And the way in which I learned it is that it was definitely taught to all of the debutantes is the wrong word, but we'll say the regal class of
Yeah.
people.
Mhm.
as a matter of their just education, right? However, because it really was kind of a patriarchy even at that time, that the male practitioner, the male kind of, upper class, if you will, would take concubines, right, and have a harem of women, but they weren't just going around picking, because they can have any woman they want, right? These are nobility.
Yeah, yeah.
That they wanted women who were knowledgeable in pleasure. And so then you had these schools who were teaching, and now these were run by women. They were teaching other women the practice of Kama Sutra.
Mm.
All right. So that's how the techniques were developed. All the techniques were
So
developed.
like he doesn't take that attitude, Dr. Nita, and you don't hear that tale told that way in the Tibetan world that much. So just out of the intellectual curiosity, so did you get that through sort of more your yogic background training,
Yeah.
that version of it? Okay,
Yes.
okay,
Yeah.
cool. I just want to like get
Yes.
context because there's some kind of little distinction being drawn that like you might not be drawing as tight as some of these Tibetan folks are. And there's nothing wrong with that. People have different slants on this story,
Yeah.
but okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
And so
Yeah.
so that was how that went, right? That was to maximize the pleasure of the prince or the duke or whatever. Okay, fine. But then you had then you had practitioners, yogic practitioners who began to learn and practice themselves. Again, what is the goal of yoga? The goal of yoga is union, right? Or essentially the removal of the fluctuations of the consciousness. Yoga chitti vritti nirodha, which is from
Mhm.
Patanjali's sutra. The goal of yoga is the calming of the fluctuations of your mind, of your consciousness. But the goal of, again, sex is bliss, is heightened states. And so the practice of Kama Sutra is that you and your partner, do not share beds. You do not share beds. You have a room for engaging in this kind of thing, or a place where you engage in your sexuality in, and then you engage for I think it's 3 days, 2 nights, 3 nights, something like this. And that's all for the month.
Ah,
That's
okay.
it.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Mhm. So you build up more like polarity and tension than then gets sort of expressed in this more intense period,
Yes.
right? And then, you know what's funny? I don't want to kill your flow, but yeah, Esther Perel talks about that. If you want to go back to our relationship episodes from last year,
Sure.
and she says you need polarity between people to build up sexual energy and tension.
Yes.
She's kind of like, it's interesting from a sort of a relationship counseling point of view.
Yeah.
So, anyways,
Yeah.
just kind of hit me. Yeah.
This is the common, this thing now is this idea of polarity is quite common now, and it's all
Yeah.
over the board as to how to do it and when to do it and who's doing it and whatever.
I haven't heard that many people. Esther Perel talked about it, but you're hearing it from a lot more people, I
Yeah,
guess,
I've,
huh?
I've heard it from a number of different sources. A lot
Okay.
of like male male driven teachers, teaching men in
Mm,
particular. So
okay.
anyway, so you got now your practitioners, now lay people. You, myself, our listeners, right? Or our watchers, audience, whatever you want to call people who watch this, okay? So you then there's two aspects to it. There's the leading up to it and then the actual practice to it. And then that kind of after effects, right? Leading up to it, you are to make yourself as attractive as possible. So you wear absolutely fresh color, fresh pressed, fresh, nice fitting, everything. You're dressed to the not you're dressed as nice and sexy as you can be dressed. You are smelling absolutely perfect, right? Which again, if you think back in the day, that would require a lot. You'd have to go to bathhouses. You'd have to, because everybody has hygiene wasn't as much as it is now. So you're perfumed up and you're bathed up and all this, and you will greet each other. You will present offerings to each other again, because this is you're looking at the other person as this like person who is going to lead you to the other side, the bliss side of life. So they are your guru, they are your dakini, they are your consort, they are they're your female partner.
They have this idea in like the Secret Assembly Tantra where they're talking about practice with elaborations, practice that's elaborate, right?
Hmm.
And so you can do the elaborate version of these things, which have a lot of positive aspects to them,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Um, and then, part of it also is the idea like you're leading this as a person who's helping me realize this bliss. So you appreciate the partner, right? And then if you get to the tantra part of this, sometimes you're seeing them as an element of the divine, right? Or you're seeing them as an aspect of like whatever goddess you think of, right? You
Mm-hmm.
kind of in your mind you see that person through that filter, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
Mm-hmm.
similar kind of a vibe. But okay, yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
interesting. Yeah.
you give them gifts, right?
Hmm.
This is physical offering for the body. You read them poetry,
Hmm.
right? So you're supposed to write and read them. I mean, you're in love with this person, so you're supposed to
Yeah.
express the way, so you have your aura, your I'm sorry, your fragrance by how you're smelling, your physical gifts of offerings, and then your offerings of the heart via your speech.
Hmm.
Then you are supposed to come together and then kind of like hug, embrace, kiss, just like your everything is very much sensual. You're heightening, you're increasing the tension. You undress each other, and then you are supposed to, again, according to this discussion I got, quote, kiss every inch of their body with your mouth and tongue.
That's kind of like yeah, that kind of is a good sexual technique.
A very good sexual technique. The whole body, the whole
Yeah,
body.
that's how it is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
everything. And then once you start, and then
That gets over feelings of like purity and impurity too, and those kinds of questions too, right?
yes,
Yeah,
yes,
you get over it.
yeah. You're supposed
Yeah.
to touch every part, kiss every part, everything.
Plus it's hot. It's
It's
hot
hot. Yeah, go
anyways.
for it. Do it. Whatever, man. You know what I'm saying?
It's
Like,
hot.
yeah.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So okay, so you have that part, and then the next part is that like it is. There are numerous techniques. Again, according to my yoga teacher, I don't know. We don't do a lot of vulgar things here, but we'll do a little bit. It's not vulgar. This is just description. So
Hmm.
if this is enticing you, then there's more. But if you're turned off, then turn it off because I'm going to continue. This is not mansplaining. This is just explaining. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So um, the male has the responsibility of making the female orgasm from the various places, right? So
Mm-hmm.
clitorally, vaginally, and then cervically, essentially.
Hmm.
And there's different and so the Kama Sutra, like we see different sex positions, they are they are there in order to connect in different ways, but they are also to maybe more specifically elicit orgasm from the different places of her sensory, inputs, right? And you do them sequentially, and they are bringing this person. Oh, the dude does not ejaculate until the very, very, very end. That
Yeah,
is
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
last
yeah.
thing that happens, right?
Yeah.
And I mean after the 3 days. You
Yeah, building up all kinds. We could talk about the whole semen retention
Yeah,
thing. It's kind of a weird
like
question, but
my teacher told me,
yeah.
he's like absolutely, you are not coming. Do not, or
Hmm.
sorry, orgasming. You
Hmm.
are not. He goes, I don't care if you have to bite your arm. The answer is no. And after, so then you're doing this, and then in between sessions, because people are gonna have to take a rest. You are to be in lover's embrace. Continue the moments from before. And then after how 2 or 3 days, I don't remember exactly. Um, then you are, you kind of you undo the binds that were done, right? So you dress back together, you give them offer, again, thank them for their time and things like this. And if they're your partner, then they're your partner, but you go back to your separate bedrooms for sleeping at that point, but not during that time. And the
Hmm.
reason is that like you want to be intermingled. And the reason why it is that you spend time apart is the polarity, but specifically it's your auras are not touching. That,
Hmm.
that you have time for you to be an integrated being. Do you know what I'm saying?
Oh, so you're kind of like processing this in a more separate individual way, and then you'll have the shared aspect of this. Transformation will happen, then you go back to your own space to like process it through, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Outside the context of another, outside the context and confines shared with another human. Okay,
Yeah.
interesting. I
Yeah.
haven't heard it. And that's
And
true. There's a thing about that, right?
yeah.
You're
Yeah.
creating like a ritual space too. This is our ritual
Yes.
magical space.
Yes.
So it's kind of gets into like sex magic things in a certain way too, right? You
Definitely.
create a ritual space. And now, okay, that ritual space is now dissolved. We're dissolving that mandala space. And now we go
Hmm.
back and we'll open that mandala ritual space again
Yeah.
when we do this again. Hmm.
And my teacher said he has had, he has had some students, some of his like yoga couples over the years who have practiced this because he's more teaching Karmamudra, but people are interested in who have partners and interested in doing this, interested in Kamasutra. So he took the last 2 hours of the last retreat we had together. And he's like, okay, we have 2 hours. We can add extra practice, or we can do a lecture on Kamasutra. Who wants what? He said, okay, raise your hand if you want, practice. Nobody said their hand, nothing. Who wants Kama Sutra? Everybody was like, yeah. And he's like,
Yeah.
okay, fine.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know, sort of tangent, but funny. That afternoon before we went back to practice, before we went back to lecture and practice and everything, I said, I've heard this my teacher say many things, but I've never heard him talk about his father, and I've never heard him say the word penis.
Uh-huh.
He said the word penis a lot that afternoon, and he tells the story about his father. So the last thing that I'll say about this is that he said that the couples that he has seen who've done this, right? People, yoga practitioners, people who lead the life of whose life is in support of their practice, and their practice is being supported by their life. The women in particular, 10 to 14 days of absolute bliss. He's like, you could
Mhm,
feel the joy and the like happiness and the sense of satisfaction radiating from their bodies.
mhm, mhm, mhm,
He's
mhm.
like, and he's like, he's like, he said it was sort of not hard for him to believe,
Uh-huh.
but almost unbelievable that they were doing this as regularly as they, for as many months along as they were, and they just the
And
experience kept
they
getting
kept
better.
up they kept up with the practice. They kept it
Yes,
going. Yeah,
yes.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
and that
Uh-huh.
it continued to get better and better. And he's like, these people they were just in such states of bliss afterwards. That was of course they still did yoga and meditate. They did all those kinds of things, but this was their bliss practice. And so I think in a so that's Kama Sutra. But in a larger scale thing, what he tries to bring forth, and I think we didn't discuss this, but for me, part of this is having an intentional practice of bliss in your life.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Do you know what
Hmm.
I'm saying? And however that is,
Yes.
however you're drawn to it, you are making your own sense of bliss, of happiness, of pleasure a daily priority. Even if you practice in Kama Sutra in the way that I just mentioned, you're preparing for those 3 days of ecstasy coming up in a few months. You're thinking in a few weeks. You're buying gifts. You're writing poetry. You're collecting whatever, new clothes, whatever it is. You know what I'm saying? You're preparing for those kinds of states, and I think it's really really important to find pleasure in as many things as possible.
It's like, yeah, there's so much like in that. I don't know if I've heard I don't know if I've heard the Kama Sutra described in all of that way, but and I'd be curious, like if his take on it is really interesting. So yeah, you know. Um, but the whole idea that like in my own experience of this, I would say, first started doing Zen, like I said last episode, then got into doing sort of things that were more the Taoist aspects of working with the sexual energies. And it was like the bliss just goes whoosh, right? And then you start to realize profound things about that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
A personal level of happiness, but also like the deep stuff we were talking about before, which is like the world is a big container of bliss if you can get to that space of
yeah,
experiencing it that
yeah,
way,
yeah,
right? And then, if you make that that element of shared sexuality so deep, and you build up to that, there'll be all of that anticipation, expectation, and then the residual bliss from the previous sessions of it, right? And then you
hmm
have that experience, and then it will keep going deeper and carry out. That's had like it's hard to get those practices to always work perfect like that. But if you've done some things like that, it is kind of amazing, that you can find those blissful spaces in that way, right?
hmm hmm
Yeah. So I suppose the Zen thing and the Taoist thing brought some of that. And then, for my kind of teacher, Master Wong, my TCM teacher and Qigong mentor, he was talking about that's just that bliss and happiness that's to pervade your life, right? So I know these things sort of started to integrate for me in this way, and that's probably why we'll all have our own stories of how these different messages and pieces get put together for us, right? Yeah, but very much so true. And then I suppose like the daily practice would be if you work with your sexual energies with another person like that in this very intense way, then that knowledge and awareness of that will carry out. And then your practices when you're not in the intimacy with that person will get more profound, right?
Mhm.
And you'll still be doing your solo meditative practices that tap into those sexual feelings and those sexual energies and carry you
Mhm.
through, right? Okay, very cool. Yeah, very cool. Thanks for sharing all that, Daniel.
Yeah.
We've been meaning to do this for a bit, and I knew there was
Yeah.
like, like you had that to share. I wasn't sure what it was going to be. So, very cool. And thanks for sharing all of that.
Yeah.
Um,
It's interesting to watch a grown, older man who was a monk, celibate monk, draw positions, draw stick figures. I'm used to seeing him drawing stick figures for yoga, but now he's drawing like two stick figures, like having sex with each other. Like
we'll have to probably do like the Taoist stuff of this too. We haven't done
oh
that. We
yeah, yeah.
probably will.
The
You
Taoist
know,
like sexual alchemical
yeah,
practices. Yeah.
yeah. But they have like their own kind of sexual sexual manuals for not for people who are being necessarily the most serious, like they're more Kamasutra part,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is just for like sexual enjoyment and sexual health and so on. But they have the whole idea that there's like these different sexual positions that are good for the different Chinese acupuncture channels.
Ooh.
You have this position, it's good for this one, and you have this position, it's good for another one. And it's Chinese stuff, so it's always named like in these really funny ways, like a woman works a loom, or know, monkey like climbs a tree, or whatever the fuck it is. You're like, is that really what that looks like? I'm not really sure. But
You're like wheelbarrow. I see that. That one I
yeah,
definitely see the wheelbarrow for sure.
yeah. Anyways, it's really they have these like Chinese names that are always after some, bizarre imagery that you're not quite sure if it makes any sense.
Mm.
All right, okay, cool. So yeah, we'll probably do some of that stuff too in the offing, since we've
Yeah.
gotten into the subject matter, might as
Yeah.
well do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Number 4.
Okay. Misconception 4, which might be the last one we do today, because there's a lot to say about it. So it really, he brings up the issue of like in doing Karmamudra, you know, do you have to have a lot of sexual partners? Do you have to have one sexual partner? Like, what's the question of like sexual partners that comes up in this? Or even talking about sexual partners, like spiritual partners, maybe. So kind of a deep question, right? I think one of the things he's trying to get to from sort of the Tibetan perspective on this is that people might think, well, maybe I'm supposed to have all kinds of different partners and maybe I don't want to do that. And so the answer is you don't have to do that, right? And then it also gets in the question of like problems then of potential sexual abuse around that, that can be a problem, right? And we've already talked about this issue a couple of times. We did it when we talked about the episodes of teachers and things like this. So, um, you know, he tries to be honest about this, and he says, well, if you get anyone who's trying to say that they have to be your sexual partner because it's their karma mudra and they're putting pressure, obviously that's bad,
Mm.
right? Whoever that person is. And I think, in these circles, I think, you do know people who found themselves in situations that, are not good around this, right? I've talked with people about
Mhm.
this who felt these kinds of pressures, and obviously that's pathological. So he addresses that. But the bigger thing that I thought was, like this is important to say, we've talked about it before. The other part of this, though, that gets brought up is it's really not a question of like number of partners. It's a question of like fit between the partners. And he talks about that a lot, which I think is, a deep and very important subject matter. So I think on the one hand, it's like it's Tibetan culture. So, it's not a monogamous culture. You don't have to have one partner in this cultural setting. Everyone can decide what they think about that for themselves. But in a tantric culture, you tend not to be as monogamous because there's this idea that you can have contact with other people and it's okay. Okay. So it's not a Judeo-Christian culture. But on the other hand, you don't have to feel there's a pressure to have lots of partners either. The most important thing of all of this is kind of the fit between the partners, right? And that's the kind of the deeper question in this. I was reminded of a couple things about this. One of the things I first read about this, which was very interesting for me, was a book by someone named Miranda Shaw. She's a, academic PhD person who did her research on, female teachers and female practitioners historically, right? And she was talking about, the book's called Passionate Enlightenment. And maybe we'll do a conversation about just that one at some point because it's kind of cool to do it. We can just do a little quick overview on it. But her point was that sometimes I think, and Dr. Nita talks about this too, the guy who wrote the introduction to Dr. Nita's book talks about this as well. There can be this idea that female partners weren't held to be equal or something, almost like you were talking about the Kamasutra thing, right? You might have nobility and there's a power dynamic that's toxic or something, right? And she was saying, no, it really is a lot of female teachers within this traditions, right? That are the ones who are passing things on. And that raises the question of like, who are your partners? And then how do you start thinking about someone who would be an appropriate or good or bad partner for you to share something like this with? So, okay, I think we're building to that. Let me throw it back to you, Daniel, first, before we kind of give what sort of talked about what kind of qualities are good in partners. But I thought, let's go back to the whole issue because you might have a lot of stuff you want to say about this. So let me throw it to you first.
So sexual partners in your own spiritual practice, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. There's so much to say, but we've also said it. We've also said a lot about it over the last year and a half, realistically, about
Mm-hmm.
relationship structure, societal acceptance, consent, mm, personal preferences, traditional versus non-traditional relationships, like whether sex is
Mm-hmm.
involved or not, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
Emotional intimacy, physical intimacy, like, all of these things the lines become blurred when you start to take off the lens of the structure of Western society that we have. And it's just very interesting because some people prefer the singular partner. They do prefer it. That's their
Mm-hmm.
preference.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
We talked about like exclusive and uniqueness, right? Way back when with Esther Perel's view of this thing. And I thought that was a really good way of breaking it down. And I feel like that goes here as well, so you can have people in your life that serve as different roles, that serve in different roles, for you, but ultimately, um, I think it comes down to personal choice. And sometimes that fits. And if, into society's rules already, and sometimes it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then you'll have to find a different community that holds that view the same as yours. So you can operate naturally and authentically as yourself within that community, right? Um, the difficult part is, and this is in every community, and does even in the acupuncture world. And Eric, you
Mm-hmm.
still teach for various schools. I just do something for a little bit because I'm slightly curious, and then I go, "Ah, it's too much responsibility. I don't want to do that." Um, you know,
Yeah.
but amongst many communities, regardless of how they look at things, spirituality is not a common thread, even amongst like alternative kind of educational processes or pathways like acupuncture or
Yeah.
massage or something. Like it's slightly more prevalent, but it's not like the overwhelming top topic of discussion.
Yeah, I could say like, and I think he'd be fine with us sharing this, but I know one of our anthropologists on retainer or on call is Ryan Davenport, right? Along with Mary Kay Ryan. And he was really pointing out that very strongly within like the alternative medicine communities, that for the most part, people really aren't that spiritual. And I think we've had conversations about this, and I think he's even tougher on that point than I am. He's quite like, nah, that was always my experience about this as someone who has probably in his own way a very high standard about that. So we've had conversations about that too. Yeah,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so
yeah,
that's my point, is that like the sexual partners and your own spiritual practice, of course, if you could blend those two things together, that's the that's very good. Very good.
maybe I'll double back and kind of say what they say in the traditional things,
Sure.
and maybe we'll work our way into some of these other questions as we go.
Sure.
So, from sort of a traditional point of view, there's this, and I had this retreat over the break, and so I was going back and looking at some of the old tantras, some of the stuff I was talking about before, you know, not so much based on sexuality per se, but how do you experience the world as bliss meditatively? And some of them, it was like, one of the particular tantras I was looking at does have that more sexual conversation to it. So I was
Yeah.
kind of flitting around in my interests. It was a tale. There's the secret assembly and the secret essence, the Guya Garbha and the Guya Samaja. So my retreat was sort of a tale of two Guyas or something. And I was kind of going through that, and that was the retreat. So the non-meditative part, the part where I was studying and learning, which was pretty good. So, anyways, they kind of give this opinion where they kind of go, it's nice to have someone who has tantric initiation if possible. That's a cool thing to have, right?
Right.
Because then you sort of share a spiritual bond, especially if those are shared initiations. That's kind of a bond between people, right? It's kind of like, I think in the tantric world, how you say that people develop kind of a sangha connection to one another,
Yeah.
you know?
A communal bond.
Yeah. And they're brought together for like karmic reasons. It's,
Mm,
not a coinky dink when you end up in the same initiation with somebody, right? There's some connection that's there drawing people together, right? So it creates kind of a bond between people. And then they talk about, it's an interesting thing because you can get people who have initiation to things, but they're still not that into it. And I think that happens like in the West. I think that happens in like a place like Tibet too.
I'm
You
sure
know,
yeah, anywhere,
you go,
everywhere.
you do the thing, and it's kind of like a cool thing you did, and then, but you're not that interested. So obviously, the more passion and interest people have in this, the more you're going to get a connection with a partner you're going to be able to share more with, right? Because you're going to share that passion and interest and connection around this
Hmm.
thing, right?
Hmm.
And then they talk about kind of education, meaning, the person wants to learn. The person wants to learn spiritually. They want to learn more about, the different parts of spirituality. Maybe they have specific interest in bliss and yogas around bliss and things like that, right? So they're trying to learn, they're trying to develop themselves, right? And then the other thing I talk about is freedom, like kind of a love for freedom. And then also probably a love, they say it interesting, they say it's kind of a freedom from pettiness, right?
Mm,
So you don't want to have like petty qualities in you. You want to have partners that like don't have petty aspects because those will always would be a problem. So it's kind of an interesting word to choose. And they mean a couple of things from that. They mean you don't want people who are uncomfortable with sexuality, for example, as a thing, or you don't want people who are really overburdened with like taboos, and they use the word taboo.
mm,
Ryan Davenport and I have talked about maybe him coming on, and the three of us talking about the anthropology of taboo,
mm,
right? But you want to have people who are free of like confining notions of taboo,
mm.
And there's sometimes, we're not talking about this exactly now, but sometimes in the tantras or in some of these spiritual stories, like I like the Rumi stories where they challenge the taboos,
Right.
because it frees the person up more, to be more psychospiritually free. So they mention things like prudery and taboo, which are kind of interesting. And then like the kleshas you want to have kind of minimalized too, right? So the person isn't dominated so much by like negative emotions, right? As much as possible. Some of those things are ones that are related back to some of the things you were talking about, Danielle. Jealousy and possessiveness are such tough questions socioculturally or in our culture too. Those are deep questions. And I was trying to talk about that if you the tantric goddess was really edgy on this point.
Hmm.
And I was trying to like channel a little bit. But those would be examples of kleshas, but also, you know, um, unhealthy attitudes towards attachment, the desire to overcome ignorances and become, have more profound visions of things. So they kind of had this really interesting thing of like going through these things and and kind of trying to say, well, this is sort of like qualities in people that you'd be looking, whatever role they're going to have in your life, these are the people that you want to add in. These are probably the people that you want in your life just anyways, to
Mm.
be honest, on some level, if you're a spiritual person. Does that make sense what I'm saying there too, Daniel?
Yeah.
To you?
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, so they have this kind of list. It's interesting. So they talk about, these kinds of things. Competitiveness isn't a good quality either, you know. So that's kind of like maybe the qualification aspect of that you get in the tantric literature, these kinds of things that they'll lay out, right?
Mm.
Um, Again, the kleshas are really interesting because they relate back to the energies of the system. So if you have a lot of like ignorance, you're not seeking wisdom, you're not seeking to transform your understanding and knowledge, then you're gonna have problems with your earth energies, and that's gonna create problems in the whole system, right? If you have problems of like possessiveness, it's going to create problems with the water energies. If you have problems with like attachment in ways where you can't manage the emotions of attachment, well, you're going to have problems with the fire energies. If you have problems of jealousy and envy, you're going to have problems with the chi energies, or the prana is going to have a problem. If you have problems with anger, it's just not good for consciousness overall. So we kind of done these kleshas and these
Mm.
aggregates before, but it makes sense in the context of really trying to build a bond with someone emotionally, but also like physically, sexually. You don't want to have as many of these kleshas dominating people, right? It's not even good energetically on
Right.
some level. So I think that's a way of talking about it too. And then what Dr. Nita does as well is he just kind of gets to the point that I think certainly I find really important. I think you do too, which is the idea that sometimes there's just special bonds between people.
Mm.
There's something in the two people that they're bonded in some way. Some like if you're doing Tibetan stuff, you'd say the uniqueness of the karma between those two beings is really powerful, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And that can manifest in not only like you feel bonded in like, oh, we have similar aspirations, we have similar interests, we have similar passions. You can feel that connection with another person in that way, right? That will
Mhm.
unite your spirits, right? Your
Right.
shens. But also the idea that like when it really gets powerful for two people, and he does mention this, which I think a lot of us have had these experiences, it's almost like the inner energetics of the two people resonate in some powerful way, right?
Mm.
We're going to talk later on about the idea of like the Vajra body. This is the way in Buddhist Tantra they talk about the chakras and the channels around the chakras and things. And they say that those energies and they use the word drops. It's an interesting phrase. Lama Glenn Mullen will sometimes compare those to like neurotransmitters and hormones and
Yeah.
things, but
Yeah.
the equivalent in the subtle body.
Push it till later. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about that deep
Yeah.
later, but
Yeah.
that's not the point. The point
Yeah.
is that these aspects of who you are will resonate with this other person,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So, this idea that your energies within who you are, the things that make you up, will resonate with this other person. And they
Hmm.
talk about these experiences, the feeling resonant with another person, and also feeling like, which a lot of us have had, the feeling like you can even feel that person from afar,
Mm.
right? Just very naturally, your being and the aspects energetically that make up your being will very naturally feel that other person,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it's a powerful experience.
Hmm.
So to me, what I found really kind of profound in that was the idea that you're getting to that bond between people that is kind of special, and those more than like even how you number of partners or these other questions. This is kind of like the core question on some level, right? Do you have a resonant thing with another person?
Hmm.
He kind of tells this interesting anecdote in the Dr. Nita does in the book, where he's basically saying there's one of the people who was, I think, one of his teachers, and he said, well, this teacher of Dr. Nita's said something like, if I'm honest, yeah, I've had different Karmamudra partners, but if I'm really honest about it, for the most part, it doesn't work as well in a lot of these situations, because you need to have something really resonant with another person for it to work,
Hmm.
you know? And I think that's really important for us to say here too. It's not just a question of like just having sex or something.
Right.
It's a question of finding someone else that you can get resonate into the space with. And then that's
Hmm.
what's going to make it powerful, you
Hmm.
know? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I think there's a lot more to say about this, but maybe we'll cut it here
I think so.
and pick up on it.
Yeah.
Ending on an interesting note, to be
Yeah.
continued.
Yeah.
What is it that makes people resonate with one another? And then, how can you start thinking about how to do this practically in your life? I think is maybe the continuation on it.
Yeah. I think it's perfect.
Yeah. Deep. Okay, cool, Daniel.
Awesome. Well,
Yeah,
as always, Eric.
thanks for sharing all this stuff from your teacher too. That
Oh
was really
yeah, yeah,
interesting.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
This is a fun
Yeah.
subject matter. So you know,
Yeah.
yeah, it's good. It's very good.
To be continued.
As
Yeah.
always, always. Eric, thank you so much for
Thank you.
riding the ship. To our audience, thanks for tuning in. Whether you're watching on whatever platform you're on or listening, we appreciate your attention, your time and your effort to listen to what we're having to say, and we really do genuinely hope that it has a positive impact on your life. if you want to, share the love, please, send us an email at ginandtantra@gmail.com. You can hit us up on the Instagram at the Gin and Tantra Podcast, or if you're watching on the YouTube, feel free to comment, even like, subscribe, do all the things, and share our work. Definitely, we appreciate it. And anytime anybody subscribes, it's free. It helps us out in the algorithm. It just tries to get our work out a little bit further than it already has. The hundreds of thousands of people who consume these products that we're creating. Anyways, yeah, thank you for tuning in. As they say, from my mouth to God's ears. But I don't know if he can hear or whatever, but maybe he might, or she, or they, or them, or cake, or whatever it is. Anyways, for
Yeah.
Eric, this is Daniel. We'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.